This is so exciting. My name's Laura Lindenfeld. I'm Dean of the School of Communication and Journalism and Executive Director of the Alan Alda Center here at Stony Brook University. I want to thank my colleague, Dr. Judy Brown-Clark, who heads the Office of DI3, Diversity, Inclusion, and Intercultural Initiatives, for supporting and co-sponsoring this event tonight. Welcome. I am so thrilled to be here to celebrate Musa's book. Musa joined us on faculty. It seems like a long time ago. You came last fall, so it's been a bit over a year, and what an amazing hire you have been. I'm so thrilled, just all around wonderful. We're here to learn a little more and talk about Musa's book, We Have Never Been Woke, The Cultural Contradictions of a New Elite, a title which I personally love. Today is the first day the book is available in stores. That deserves a round of applause. And I'm so glad you're here to celebrate with us and learn a little bit more about this incredibly smart, thought-provoking book. This book takes a sharp look at people who are probably a lot like most of us in this room. Those of us who make our living based on ideas, technical skills, social prestige. Maybe we do a little less on the social prestige here at Stony Brook, but we sure care a lot about ideas. Through really careful and thoughtful analysis and research, Musa's compassionate book points out the stark contrast between our expressed opinions and our actions, and the adverse effects our behaviors and institutions often have on people who may be less fortunate than we are. Tonight, we're also joined by Colleen Eren, a Long Island native. Welcome. All the way from Huntington. Dodged the traffic. She's a sociologist at William Patterson University in New Jersey, so you crossed the state line to come speak with us tonight, and a research fellow with Heterodox Academy, where Musa has had a lot of involvement as well. Colleen's book, Reform Nation, looks at the long process of consensus building that led to the passage of the First Step Act, the most significant criminal justice legislation to be passed in the U.S. in decades. And it also explores how this moment of consensus rapidly fell apart. The research exploring how social justice movements succeed and fail make her a particularly great person to engage in this conversation tonight, so I can't wait to hear the ideas and themes that emerge. At a time in our country and in much of the world, unfortunately, where we tend to be deeply divided over ideas and even what reality is, books like yours, the two of yours, can help us see ourselves and others more clearly. And for that, I am eternally grateful for people producing ideas about ideas that can help us form a better society. I'm going to hand this over to my colleague, Dr. Judy Brown-Clark. Thank you all for coming, and I look forward to conversation.
So I have the pleasure of welcoming you, and this is really exciting for me. I have my notes, and I never read my notes, but I do that just in case I forget something. Here's why this is so extraordinarily timely and important in this noisy world that we live in. How do we do it well? What do we measure it by? How are we making impacts? What communities are we serving? What do we consider success? What is sustainable? Are we making a difference? At the end of our lives, with our very last breath, can we say, job well done? So I love both of your books, and I love your framing, and I love your desire to take us through a journey of really through humanity, but accountability. It's okay. I love, bless everyone's heart, through the humanity piece. Become 7 inches higher if you have a long neck, up to your brain. And what is the strategy around that? And one of the things that I'm really interested to hear in your discussion is, how do I do it right? How does my office do it right? How do we model for our students so that they can develop the critical skills and the methods, the resiliency, the tenacity, and the motivation to really sophisticatedly, I made that word up, sophisticatedly navigate what we want to be, who we are, with the resilience that we still have hope to do this better. And so I read no notes that I wrote, but I'm extremely excited to hear the conversation, because I think deep within your scholarship, deep within your experience and your truth, and all the things that you've researched, you've come to a spot and you're standing in a space that really gives us the ability to answer these complex and complicated questions that have faces and heartbeats. So with that, no further ado, I'd like to bring up Musa and Colleen.
Okay, I also have notes. I'm going to grab them real quick. All right, so first I'd like to start by thanking all of you for coming. Thanks to Judy Brown-Clark in the DI3 office for both for the lovely introduction and for helping sponsor this event. You know, not every college and university has diversity offices that are really viewpoint diversity and constructive disagreement and things like this as part of the mandate. But here at Stony Brook, from the very beginning, your office has been like one of my biggest champions, and that's something that I really appreciate and love. Thank you as well to Heterodox Academy, who helped bring Colleen to campus today. Dean Lindenfeld, thank you so much for authorizing this event, for helping support this event and make it happen. Lori Kai and Lisa Pfeiffer in the School of Communication and Journalism valiantly worked as well to kind of bring this event to life. And so did my wife back there. Nope, there. And who also works in the Alda Center for Communicating Science in the School of Communication and Journalism. And I got my kiddos next to her there as well. And then, of course, finally, thank you, Colleen, for agreeing to take part in this conversation. I want to save as much time as possible for the conversation between us. So I'll just start by kind of setting the table a little bit. So the core puzzle that my book, We Have Never Been Woke, is trying to explore is this. Basically, starting in the period between World War I and World War II, the interwar period, and then accelerating a lot after the 1970s, there was these shifts to the global economy that favored what you might call the knowledge professions, the symbolic industries, so things like science and technology, education, media, law, consulting, and so forth, administration. And people who work in these fields, as Laura noted, they traffic in things like data and idea and rhetoric and images and so on. These symbolic capitalists, as I call them, one of the things that's unique about them is that they're the Americans who are most likely to self-identify as anti-racists, as environmentalists, as allies to LGBTQ people, as feminists, and so on. And from the outset, a lot of our professions have defined themselves through a commitment to social justice and altruism. So for instance, journalists are supposed to be the fourth estate that holds elites to account. We're supposed to speak truth to power and be a voice for the voiceless. Academics are supposed to follow the truth wherever it leads and to tell the truth without regards to anyone's political agendas or economic interests and so on. And from the beginning, symbolic capitalists, we successfully won extraordinary pay compared to most other workers, high prestige compared to most other workers, a lot of autonomy compared to most other workers. We achieved these benefits largely because we argued that if you give us these things, it will be good for everyone in society, especially the least among us. And in the years that followed, we got a lot of what we asked for. We argued that by consolidating more and more resources and power in our hands, we'd have unprecedented social cohesion and progress and prosperity. Under our rule, we argued, opportunities would be allocated according to merit, resources would be redistributed according to need, disputes would be adjudicated by disinterested experts who would make decisions in the best interests of the common good instead of anyone's myopic, selfish priorities. And as a consequence of this, long-standing social problems and social tensions would be ameliorated, and we'd have this kind of shared understanding of facts and of the correct course of action in the world. Over the last century, the global economy has been increasingly oriented around people like us. But to put it mildly, things haven't played out quite like we had planned. Instead, the US has seen slowing innovation, economic stagnation, rising inequalities, increasing affective polarization, a so-called crisis of expertise, diminishing trust in one another, diminishing trust in institutions, increasing institutional dysfunction, and allegedly epistemic chaos. And so the core thing that the book is trying to figure out is basically what went wrong here? What's going on with this? Why does the world we live in look so different than the world we promised, despite the fact that we have more power than ever, more influence in society than ever? That's the main puzzle. There are a couple of other puzzles that the book is trying to explore as well. For instance, why is it that the people who benefit the most from what sociologists would call systemic or institutional inequality, so the people who benefit the most from institutionalized racism or systemic sexism, why is it that those same people happen to be the people who are most conspicuously concerned with what you might call ideological racism or sexism? So people saying or thinking or feeling the wrong things about women or minorities or sexual minorities. How is it that elites whose lifestyles and livelihoods are oriented around the production and maintenance and exploitation of inequalities still understand themselves as egalitarians? If social justice discourse and symbolic kind of social justice actions that we often gravitate towards seem to have little to do with tangibly fixing a lot of social problems, if they don't seem to well reflect the will and the interests of the people that we purport to serve and the people we want to help, what do these conspicuous displays we engage in, what do they actually accomplish? What functions do they serve? Who actually benefits from these behaviors and how? Insofar as social justice discourse is co-opted by elites to serve our interests, how precisely does it come to serve these alternative functions? How aware are we of the fact of this kind of dissonance between our lifestyles and our behaviors and our professed beliefs? How do we reconcile these tensions to the extent that we recognize them at all? Why is it that the winners in the prevailing order seem so helpless, seem so eager to paint themselves as helpless victims, or as marginalized and disadvantaged and vulnerable, or as allies of the same? If it's a genuine disadvantage to be a woman or a minority or LGBTQ or disabled, then why are so many elites so eager to identify themselves as these very things, or to publicly associate themselves with people who can, often even to the point of bending the truth to accomplish this goal? What's the deal with the so-called Great Awakening? There seems to have been this rapid and substantial change in how we talk and think about social justice over the last decade. But is there really a there? And if so, what caused it? Why did it happen when it did? Who was affected and how? Is this kind of period of heightened vigilance around social justice just a phase, or is it the new normal? So these are some of the questions that the book wrestles with. Just by very briefly, I'll say a few words of how I became to be interested in these questions, because of course, social scientists aren't randomly assigned. They're objects of study, and we often come into the things that we study for very particular reasons. In my case, part of what moved me on the path to investigating these specific questions of all the other things that I could be doing with my time and my attention is that until 2016, I'd spent pretty much my whole life in a smallish military town in southern Arizona, not far from the Mexico border. It was a county that helped keep the state of Arizona red. It was a very red state. A very red county and at that time a red state. I started my academic journey at Cochise Community College in Sierra Vista, Arizona, and I took classes off and on, kind of working throughout, eventually earning a BA and an MA at my local university, University of Arizona. But I had a hard time finding good work at the town that I lived in and grew up in, and so ultimately I ended up selling shoes at Dillard's, which is like Macy's of the South, if you're not familiar. I actually met my wife at Dillard's. I sold her shoes. And I was really great at selling shoes, actually. I was one of the top salespeople in the store. I was a pace setter, which is what they call someone who sells more than $300,000 a year in sales. That's a lot of shoes. But there's a management position open at Dillard's, and I was passed over for this management position. I was recommended by the local store manager and the other assistant managers, but the district manager vetoed them because he thought I was overqualified and unlikely to stay at that job. And so I left. And so in 2016, a good 13 years after I graduated high school, I started on a PhD at Columbia. Columbia offered a pretty good graduate stipend, ironically, it was more than I had ever made working full-time in Arizona. But Manhattan is an expensive place to live, and so I worked while I was completing my PhD for Heterodox Academy, who helped kind of round out our income while I was attending college. Politically, I grew up in the age of neoliberalism. So the Cold War had ended when I was pretty young. And America presided over this kind of unipolar global order. And it seemed like everything from poverty to AIDS to war itself, we could fix it with the right mix of kind of free markets and technocratic know-how. And at the time, again, as I mentioned, my area skewed decisively red. But having came of age in the aftermath of 9/11 and the war on terror, I kind of went the other direction. It's funny, my mom, she still introduces me to people as her liberal son. And that's not the way I'm coded in my current context, typically. But at the time, I subscribed to what you might think of as kind of the banal liberal understanding of social problems. So if you had asked me who's to blame for various social ills, I would have said, those darn Republicans. If only Podunk, Arizona could be more like the enlightened denizens of New York. What a beautiful country this could be. What a beautiful world this could be if only we were more like the people in Manhattan. And then I moved to Manhattan. And one of the first things that stood out to me when I moved to Manhattan is that there's something like a racialized caste system there that everyone takes for granted. So you have disposable servants who will clean your house and watch your kids and walk your dogs and deliver prepared meals to you. If you need something from the store, someone else will go get that thing from the store and drop it off at your place. People will show up outside of your door to take you wherever you want to go with a push of a button. And it's mostly minorities and immigrants from particular racial and ethnic backgrounds who fill these roles, while people from other racial and ethnic backgrounds are the ones being served. The former earn peanuts for their work, the latter are well off, and this is all basically taken for granted. It's just assumed that this is kind of the normal way that society operates. And yet, the way things operate in places like New York City or Los Angeles isn't the way things go in most other parts of the country. So for instance, in many American locales, the person buying a pair of shoes, I'll stick with my shoe sales, the person buying a pair of shoes and the person selling that pair of shoes, they're often likely to be the same race, white, and the socioeconomic gaps between the buyer and the seller are also likely to be much smaller. Even the most kind of bigoted, sexist, rich white person in many other contexts, they just wouldn't be able to exploit women and minorities at the same way that a liberal professional in a city like Seattle or San Francisco or Chicago does in their day-to-day lives. The infrastructure just isn't there. Instead, it's these progressive bastions associated with the knowledge economy that are places with these really well-oiled machines for casually exploiting and discarding people who are vulnerable and desperate and disadvantaged. And it's largely democratic voting professionals who take advantage of this system of exploitation, even as we conspicuously lament inequality. And so moving to New York kind of set me on this question, and my time at Columbia really sharpened this set of concerns that I had. But I'll leave it there for now, because actually I'm really interested in kind of digging into these issues with Colleen, so I'll just stop there, and I'll join Colleen, and we'll talk about these issues some more. Thank you.
Well, first of all, I'm honored to be here for the official launch of Musa's book. As someone who has studied a particular social movement around criminal justice reform and kind of the prospects and the perils of having a movement led by philanthropists and symbolic capitalists, I thought that this book was really a wonderful complement to my own thinking and just stimulated so many questions. But first I wanted to give some comments about Musa's book and the importance of this book. So as a sociologist, fellow sociologist, I just appreciated that this book was not only one of a poignant kind of cultural critique, there are certainly many of those, and because it shows the ways in which the gestures towards social justice show that they're actually in the interest of power many times. And they work against meaningful progress, as I allude to in my book too. But also, as the dean alluded to, you know, it doesn't leave us out of this. It takes up the uncomfortable task of the study of sociology of the elites, which is, as Musa knows well, a tiny percentage of what is produced within sociology. Typically, what we look at in sociology is the pathologization of the poor. We're looking down the ladder to see what's wrong with those people. It includes all of us in it, as the dean alluded to, students here who are entering the knowledge economy, professors like me who've made careers about writing about social problems, and journalists here who believe that you're bringing attention to the plights of the less advantaged, again, studying down the social ladder, or the opposite, which is we look really far up. We look way ahead of us, and instead, what Musa does is he makes us look in the mirror. And it reminds me in this way of the work of other luminaries in this space, like Richard Reeves in Dream Hoarders, or Rachel Sherman. And it shows how we're implicated in this story. And how, in spite of our best intentions, or maybe because of our best intentions, we reproduce those very structures that are advantageous to ourselves and to those in our class, in our political tribe, or those within our totemic groups, to use something from that. And Musa uses the term throughout the book, "oi," in the discussion, and I think that's very powerful. He doesn't let us off the hook. And so the story is one that brings us through how moments of focus on social ills, or what he calls awakenings, are not confined to the last 15 years, which was very illuminating to me. I had studied in my book, erroneously, about this unique configuration of the past 15 years and the past 20 years. I would revise it because of his book. But actually it has a history in the United States, and you see these attitudinal shifts as he shows an interest around identity issues through the periods of 4 great awakenings. But these are moments, and also this was illuminating to me, where you don't have actual progress happening. The progress actually happened before that. And so it was unrelated. All of this hullabaloo about change, already it was unrelated to allocation of resources or changes in the law. And so what this means, what awakening is actually a period when elites like us are overproduced. When there are so many of us, we can't be absorbed well into society and the economy, and we feel like we're missing out. And so we agitate and we affiliate ourselves with the plight of the truly marginalized. And so we go woke, and we make these verbal commitments online and comments. And apparently Musa got stuck with some comments today that demonstrated that kind of understanding, while those who are truly marginalized help us get our food, clean our places, and will bring us the copy of the book through Amazon. And so we legitimate ourselves and the well-paying jobs that we're able to get through our wokeness, and we try to derive from them capital from it, political, economic, social, cultural, and even totemic, when we rely on something about our identities in order to gain prestige. Something that I appreciate about Musa's book was the generosity of spirit with which he wrote it. In addition to including us in the critique, he also kind of gives us some grace, which is to say that this is not intentional, this is not some type of malevolence on our part. We think we're doing right, and therein actually is part of the problem. We think we're being morally righteous. We think we're doing good. And so the book takes a really hard look at people like us behind the Great Awakenings, at our institutions, colleges, the media, and the symbolic capitalists. It isn't blaming, and perhaps this is a problem for where he positions himself now as no longer being considered liberal, but he doesn't blame the MAGA folks for being hopeless cretins. And if they just understood a little bit more, or if they were just more like Manhattanites or Huntingtonites, they would help lead us to utopia. But at the same time, it isn't adopting the language that I find so repugnant in some of the other cultural critiques of wokeness. I'm thinking of Gad Saad's book about the parasitic mind. It's not calling us snowflakes. Or like some heterodox people, unfortunately, are saying that wokeness as such is bad, or a pseudo-religion, or some such. And so, in addition, I thought Musa did an excellent job in the book of keeping his politics out of it. We can maybe infer it, but he doesn't offer prescriptions. And so to begin the conversation, I'd like to press him a bit on some of that, especially since the title of the book has woke in it. So when the book says we've never been woke, he's actually using it in a positive way, perhaps going back to the origins of the term in the 1930s, which talked about someone actually committed to the cause, and then showing how through the Great Awakenings, we've actually never been woke in the positive sense of the term. And so in the final chapter, he doesn't answer this question, but I would like to know, and I'm sure we all like to know, but what would it mean to be woke in the positive sense of the term? What would it mean for those objectives to be fulfilled? What kind of political projects do you see as actually being an example of woke politics?
Yeah. So I end the book in a kind of willfully unsatisfying way. So a lot of books, it's like there's 7 chapters describing a problem, and then in one chapter they give you your 12 steps to kind of fix everything or whatever. And that chapter is usually the weakest chapter in the book. It's usually really unsatisfying. So I just decided to not do that. And and thankfully, I was able to convince the publisher that this was the right move. But in part too, because I think this question of what an effective approach to social justice would look like, I think that's really important. It's like the question, right? It's like the important question. I don't have a robust answer to that yet. I'm wrestling with it, and this is part of why I hope to leave it on this unsatisfying note, because I want to think with other people and continue thinking about it myself. But I have some kind of rudimentary ideas that I've been kicking around. If I did write that chapter,
the third book. There's another one already coming.
So there is another one already coming. But if I did write that chapter, some elements would include things like this. Like, for one, I think it's really important for people who want to do good to really think clearly about whether or not the specific things they're doing have any relationship, a meaningful relationship to the thing that they're trying to accomplish. So in the introduction of the book, I described this scene I observed in Manhattan where during COVID, there were, in the aftermath of George Floyd being murdered, there were these demonstrations that would happen on the Upper West Side of Manhattan where people would gather in the medians of Broadway Boulevard, and they'd wave these signs saying Black Lives Matter, and then cars would honk at the signs and they'd go, yeah. And as I highlight in the book, I mean, oftentimes the people waving these signs in the middle of Broadway, they'd literally be like stepping over homeless people, waving the signs. And And that in itself was kind of jarring. But more important than that kind of contradiction, which is what really caused me to pay attention to it and go, okay, well, what are we doing here? But then there's this question, like, what are we doing here? Like, in what way would waving a sign at a car and then going beep, beep, and you going, like, under what circumstance would that get anyone out of prison, stop anyone from getting killed, and so on? If we can't tell a story about how what we're doing relates to the thing we want to accomplish, if there's no way that we can really tell a story for us shaking a sign saves anyone's life or gets anyone out of jail or something like that, then we should really ask ourselves, like, then who are we doing this for? We're clearly not doing it. We're not doing it, practically speaking, we're not doing it to get anyone out of jail, because this is not going to get anyone out of jail, right? So then why are we doing it? I think being mindful of this question of correspondence between what we're doing and what we hope to accomplish is one important example of what I would include in that final chapter.
And something I think that was very poignant in your not giving the answer of what this looks like is that you say, you know, there are actual voices that we should be hearkening to, the people who are directly impacted, the marginalized. And I think that, you know, in my own experience with listening to the leadership of criminal justice reform, the real emphasis is we know the problems that have to be fixed in prison. We have to ask the people who are actually in prison what they are. Otherwise, we're making all of these kinds of assumptions. And so I think incorporating the people who are actually most affected, but what would that look like? Yeah.
So oftentimes, I mean, the history of the United States and actually nonprofits around the world, other and even government programs around the world are kind of replete with examples of kind of well-intentioned technocrats and ideologues who create great harm to the people they're trying to help because they don't have skin in the game, or they're not sufficiently consulting with the people that they're trying to do things for. And so I think that should definitely be in front of people's minds. One of the kind of structural problems that we have often when we're trying to do good, we're trying to help people, is that, like, say if we want to know what do African Americans want or what do African Americans think, rather than say consulting, let alone conducting any kind of nationally representative sample, or even a sample of the local community, or even just going out and talking to ordinary people in your community about what do they want, what do they need. Instead, what people tend to do is they will go, oh, what do black people think about this? Well, let me go to the New York Times and see what
Don Lemon has to say.
What Don Lemon has to say on CNN. You know, God bless him, he's no longer there. But and the problem with that is that a lot of the people who are in these kinds of positions at the New York Times and the Atlantic and or fancy academics like myself, we may not be super representatives of the groups that we're purporting to represent. And our interests and our values are tend to be far out of step with those of the, say, modal black person. And so often what people end up doing, not what they want to do necessarily, but what they end up doing. And we look to these other symbolic capitalists and other elites who happen to have affiliation with marginalized and disadvantaged groups. What we end up doing in practice is kind of reaffirming our own prejudices and our own vision of the world, because a lot of these other folks who work for the New York Times or who are teaching at Harvard or Princeton or whatever, they share the same worldviews for the most part, the same values, the same interests as a lot of their white or non-black colleagues. And so if we look to them first and not other black people, then we can end up with this kind of misleading picture of the world. And interestingly, sometimes we're even intolerant of trying to get those perspectives. So one thing that is fried into my brain is in 2020, there was a journalist, Lee Fang, who went out on the street just interviewing people about Black Lives Matter. He interviewed black people about Black Lives Matter. And The Intercept ran a report where they just included a lot of these people that he talked to, including an African-American who was not a fan of Black Lives Matter, the organization, or even the movement for Black Lives Matter broadly. And Lee Fang got fired for this, got fired for for showing the perspective of an ordinary black person that disagreed with the perspectives of black elites, got fired. And so often we're not even necessarily even interested or tolerant in hearing voices from ordinary people, or especially disadvantaged people, that diverge from our own.
Because I think there's this patronizing attitude that because of the privilege that we're given via education or class status, or having rose up the meritocratic ranks, that we know better than the people themselves. And so there's this, subtle racism or subtle classism of presuming to know better than they are what the problems were. And as you said, we don't have to then be the ones who are the victims or the collateral consequences of policies that we put in place.
Yeah, if stuff goes wrong, it's not our children who are bearing the cost. It's not our communities being ravaged. I mean, a good example of this is, you can see it with respect to a lot of policies around COVID, for instance. Like when I was in Manhattan and my kids and the school shut down, and a lot of these lockdowns were espoused in the name of social justice, like a lot of the people. And so myself and other people at Columbia and who worked in similar jobs, if our kids were home from school, that's fine. Like I had my son in my office with me as I was, and I could make sure he was staying on task, unlike some of his friends whose parents had, were out of the house and they just left their kids with the laptops and their phones and like, good luck, kids. So my kid...
That turned out really well, by the way. Reading scores improved, math scores.
Yes. Well, and this is the thing, is like when you look at the actual outcomes of these policies, they've been devastating, especially for students who are less advantaged, for students who are ethnic minorities and so on. Like devastated, years lost that can never be, that can't easily be recovered. This is a policy that was initiated in the name of social justice that had these really devastating consequences for the very people that we were trying to help. And the reason we weren't able to recognize some of those consequences and adverse downstream effects is because our lives are very, very different from the people we're trying to help. For us, again, it's not a big inconvenience. We can make sure our kids are fine. We can keep them on track. We can spend more time with them. There was actually some things that were, there was so much that was horrible. But, I got to spend more time with the kids during the day, which was a blessing and a curse. But, it's not like that for a lot of other people. Again, you just have to leave your kids and hope for the best. And a lot of them are just doing other stuff on the computer totally checked out. We don't see that. It's hard for us to fully process how other people might be.
The imperative for marginalized people to stay safe actually backfired against that.
Yeah, the only way that even we could stay safe, especially in Manhattan, we wouldn't go out to restaurants and all this other stuff. We didn't want to go to the grocery store. So we had other people do it, like the people whose parents who had to leave their kids at home with a laptop and a cell phone. They were the ones bringing us groceries, and they were the ones bringing us DoorDash meals and things like this, so that we could stay safe, right? And this is, I'll say real quick too. On this question of whose perspectives do we value? There's this essay that haunts me by Berkeley Cooper in Current Affairs. It's called "Who Gets to Create Black Culture?" And Cooper points out, right, that if, after George Floyd was killed, there were all of these stories and specials and, this intense focus on Floyd, the celebration of him, and all of a million takes about George Floyd and his life and what his death represents and so on. But the reality is, if George Floyd hadn't been killed and he wanted to write for The Atlantic or the New York Times, he never would have been able to. We don't care what people like George Floyd think. People like George Floyd do not get space in the New York Times, in The Atlantic, and the Washington Post. They don't get to air their perspectives and make shows for HBO and stuff like that. Perversely, it's only when George Floyd became a victim of state violence that anyone thought his life had any meaning, that he became significant. And he became significant mostly because we could use him then. We could use his death in the name of our power struggles. And there's something really sick about that, right?
Well, that provides a great segue, because I was going to ask you, you've written about the criminal justice reform movement, and particularly about defined. And so I wanted to talk a bit about how you thought symbolic capitalists influenced that movement. And do you think there's, and I have my own thoughts about this, of course, has there been anything positive that the symbolic capitalists have done for the criminal justice reform movement whatsoever?
Okay. Yeah, so one of the things that the book points out is that some people kind of trace the beginning of what we call the Great Awakening to the emergence of Black Lives Matter and things like this. As I show in the book, summoning a lot of data, I'm a wizard, marshaling a lot of data. In fact, a lot of the changes that we see actually started, after, basically began with Occupy Wall Street. And so they actually preceded, and this kind of movement that was already underway among symbolic capitalists, already heightened vigilance around social justice and so on, helps explain why movements like Black Lives Matter and Me Too were able to break through when so many other movements to bring attention to these same issues had a hard time getting traction in the same way. So rather than it being the case that Black Lives Matter helped create this whole period of, it was actually a beneficiary of something that it didn't actually create. One of the things that, as you read your book, which I would recommend everyone do, it's published with, so your book, it goes through this really long, painstaking process of consensus building to create the First Step Act, which was signed into law under Trump. And this was a really long process, and before well before the Great Awakening got underway or anything like that. And it was, you could see this kind of growing interest in criminal justice reform, not just among liberals and people on the left and Democrats and so on, but even Republicans and conservatives. You had people like David French and others, for instance, who were growing increasingly vocal about the need for some kind of change.
And that was starting in the 1970s, too. This was not just something of the 2000s.
Absolutely. And so there's this kind of painstaking consensus that was built over decades. And that rapidly kind of eroded, shortly after, over the course of the Great Awakening. One of the reasons why it eroded was because one of the things that happens during these periods of awakening is a lot of times these knowledge economy professionals, symbolic capitalists, we try to distinguish ourselves from their colleagues, make ourselves seem more worthy of status and good positions and stuff by trying to kind of outflank them in our commitment to social justice. I'm more committed than you. In fact, what your position is this kind of moderate, soft position that's not going to change anything. Get out of here with your kind of normie liberal.
If you're not abolishing the whole thing, why bother?
And so then you see this ratcheting effect where, the people, and by the end of the kind of, by the end of this period of awakening, you had a non-trivial share of people taking positions like defund the police completely or abolish prisons entirely. And the striking thing about this is, of course, that if you actually poll African Americans, for instance, who are held to be the primary beneficiaries of these reforms, if you poll African Americans were not fans of a lot of these policies, of certainly not defunding or reducing.
They were the least likely in that survey of the boroughs to want to have the funds for police.
Yeah, because they have real safety concerns. They have real safety concerns for their children, concerns for their property even, and the concerns for the property. A lot of times, people will be like, "Oh, a bike got stolen." A bike is stolen. You shouldn't call the cops for that. You shouldn't risk someone's life, this kind of interaction with the police over something trivial like property can be replaced. And it's easy for symbolic capitalists to think like that. If my bike got stolen, that would suck. It's a nice bike. But I could just go buy another. I would buy another one. But if you're someone who's just barely paying the bills and your bike gets stolen and you
need to make those food deliveries.
Use a bike to get to, you can't just replace it. In fact, to even hope to replace it, you need to earn money, which you need the bike to do, right? And so you get stuck at losing that bike is devastating for you. It's a big problem. And so a lot of these kinds of concerns that people have in lower income communities are, they have significant concerns, not just for their physical safety, but even for their property, to allow them to live like decent lives, relatively stable, decent lives with some measure of security and stability. And then the same thing with the idea of abolishing prisons. Like, when we talk about abolishing prisons, like, where are the people who get out of prison going to go? They're not going to go to the Upper West Side. They're going to go to areas that are poorer and more minority concentrated. And in fact, a thing that I highlighted in the intro to the book is even in the midst of the Black Lives Matter movement, during COVID in Manhattan, the way that the city chose to respond to to help stop the spread in this kind of overcrowded homeless shelters and get homeless people off the streets so they're not spreading COVID randomly. They tried to confine everyone, lock everything down. So they tried to converting a bunch of hotels into shelters. And this was supposed to be a win-win, because the hotels, no one was going on tour to Manhattan during COVID, right? It was not the place to be. So a lot of hotels were kind of struggling to stay afloat. So the idea is you put homeless people in hotels, it's a win-win. But people on the Upper West Side who are very committed to social justice and principle, it's a voting district that went 95-5 for Hillary Clinton in 2016 and even more for Biden in 2020. In the midst of this pandemic, they're so concerned about social justice. In the midst of the post-George Floyd moment, when they tried to house homeless people on the Upper West Side, a lot of them rallied together to basically say, "Not in my backyard."
And to bring back broken window style policing, that there's all this disorder outside of my house, and so we want that back.
And so what they did is they ended up relocating the homeless people then to less affluent neighborhoods, more minoritized neighborhoods. And so people who are already the people who are suffering the most from COVID also had to deal with any of the challenges that came with hardship, housing large numbers of unsheltered people in their neighborhoods, because people like us didn't want to deal with it. We have the clout to not have to do it if we don't want to, and we didn't want to. Social justice.
This is especially on Long Island, as we people who are re-entering from prison. The most liberal towns don't want it, and so it's much easier to get housing or try to get in places like Brentwood, but the same problem reproduces itself.
Oh, I should for people who don't know. So Colleen actually runs she co-leads a nonprofit that helps women and children, like women who are formerly incarcerated, to kind of become reintegrated and flourish in society.
Yes, I'm on the board, though, so we've encountered the same kind of dynamic, which is that we love it in principle that these women need a place to stay home, but just not in my backyard, including all the symbolic capitalists who are in our more liberal towns on Long Island. Since Fatima is showing me that there's only a few minutes left, I have so many questions, but I think that I'll put the last one, because it's only 5 minutes. So the last question that Musa leaves us with in his book was, practically speaking, these are questions for the future. Practically speaking, what, if anything, might be done to escape the socio-political and cultural doom loop that we seem to be trapped in? And so we might have time for another question, but based on that, based on your work, what is your gut reaction to how do we get out of this period of socio-political and cultural doom?
Yeah, so that's actually the topic of the second book. So
I won't give it away. Okay.
So for this book, I need to write a whole book to answer that question, basically. And so the first book, this book is about knowledge economy professionals and the institutions that we're part of and the communities that we're part of. And what I had hoped to do initially was, in the latter half of the book, kind of turn the analytic lens from the winners in the knowledge economy to people who perceive themselves to be the losers, people who feel like they don't have a voice or a stake in our institutions, people who live in smaller towns, more rural areas, or who work in fields associated with, providing physical goods and services. People who tend to vote for the Republican Party are increasingly shifting that way. People who work service jobs and working class jobs and stuff have been consistently shifted to GOP over the last decade. Including growing numbers of religious minorities and ethnic minorities and so on. And so I had hoped to do that in the space of one book, to kind of turn the analytic lens the other way and look at the struggle between them and us, and explore this question of the doing a little bit, can we get out of it, and how that proved to be way too much for one book. But fortunately, I wrote 2 books at the same time, basically, so that the second book will delve into that.
But you point out to get to that point about minorities going more to the Republican Party, and how Latinx is despised by most people who are actually Latino. You point out something which is counterintuitive, but it's that the more morally righteous that we think we are, the more we consider that our actions are unbiased, the more we think that our side is on the tribe or on the side of angels, the more we're likely to demonstrate the opposite behavior of exhibiting bias, acting immorally, and writing off people who are harmed by our group interests as unworthy of consideration. And I thought a lot about Arlie Hochschild when I was reading your book here. Arlie Hochschild wrote Strangers in Our Own Land, where she looked at the Tea Party and tried to bridge the gap between her understanding as a Berkeley, dyed-in-the-wool blue liberal, and those people in the South who might be attracted to things like the Tea Party. And so, how do we get over those kind of instinctive biases that we have, especially at the current moment? And is that something that happens interpersonally, or is it something that happens societally? And to come to the question of DEI, how is DEI involved in making that type of wall climbing? I think Arlie Hochschild says climbing over the empathy wall. Yeah. How do we make that happen?
Yeah, so one of the biggest problems that I think we face as academics and journalists is that the people who take part in a lot of these knowledge professions tend to be this really narrow and idiosyncratic slice of society. That creates a problem for us in terms of legitimacy as well, because a lot of people, again, they don't feel like they have a voice and a stake in our institutions, and so they basically, or they think that the institutions are actually hostile towards people like that. And so a kind of rational response to institutions that you're helping to pay for, that you don't have a voice or a stake in, and that seem hostile to people like you, is to try to burn those things down, basically. And that's what you see a lot of people trying to do. So it's a problem for us in terms of legitimacy, but it's also a problem for us in terms of epistemology, that is, in terms of trying to understand the social world. So a lot of the, like in academia, we have a lot of these systems, like peer review, or making hiring and promotion decisions by committee, and things like that are kind of premised on the idea that each of us are fallible. We have limited knowledge, we're prone to error, we have biases, and the idea is that by kind of thinking together collectively, we can transcend our own individual shortcomings and produce something together that's greater than any of us could individually do, and approach objective, comprehensive truths and things like this. The problem is, those systems really only work when we actually do have substantively different values and experiences and life experiences and interests and stuff on the table.
And that's when you say that, one of the things that's great about Musa's book is he doesn't trash the ideas of wokeness that are valuable. And so the idea of positionality, that we come from backgrounds that are representative of different experiences, that is valuable. The problem is that everyone who's sitting around the table in peer review or in these kind of conformist spaces of academia and journalism, we're not coming from different backgrounds.
We tend to be, from highly educated, relatively affluent, urban and suburban backgrounds. And this is a problem because in a context where we don't have this, and almost all of us are Democrat or liberal. Some of us, the big divide in academia is between liberals and leftists. So what the big divide is how far to the left are you? The
centrists are the rightists at this point.
Yeah. People on the center absolutely are and so in a world where you have this kind of dynamic, where you actually don't have this substantive difference in terms of the values and worldviews and experiences and stuff like that, when it's too homogenous, then these processes and institutions that are supposed to help us think better actually help us think worse. Instead of helping correct our biases, they can exacerbate them. You can get misinformation cascades. Instead of making it easier, this kind of contentious processes, instead of making it easier for divergent views to come through, it can be harder for divergent views to come through. It can become really hard if everyone is on the blue team and you try to say something that's inconvenient for the blue team. It can be really hard to get that thing through peer review and published and so on, as Lord knows, I know firsthand. And in fact, I have a paper that I published in the American Sociologist and a talk that I did recently that looking at how social scientists try to study Trump and Trump supporters. And what I show is that there are a whole bunch of works that have glaring errors. Like, they're not just like, oh, well, let me quibble about the method that you used, and is that the correct method? But like obvious errors, like stark errors that not only the authors couldn't see because the findings went the wrong way, right? So not only could the authors not see these glaring errors, but neither could the peer reviewers who looked at them, and neither could the editors, and neither could a lot of the readers who were citing these works, or the journalists who were providing good coverage of this systematic blind spot. There's something that's right in front of your face that once you point it out, no one can miss it. But until someone points it out, you literally can't see it because we all share the same. And this is a problem. We have these kind of misinformation cascades and this kind of systematic blind spots. It's a real problem. And the solution, it's not something that we can just bootstrap our way out of, like individually can just bootstrap our way out of bias and finitude. Instead, this is an institutional thing. Like the premise undergirding a lot of these systems is actually right. We do think better together, and we really do need these kinds of different stakeholders to help us correct our own biases and shortcomings and help us achieve a more complete knowledge. The problem is right now, that doesn't describe our institutions.
And I think that as a closing comment, Musa has done this in two ways, one of which is kind of quasi-institutional through his work at Heterodox Academy, which is now finding its moment as, colleges are discussing where has viewpoint diversity gone. And so, through that work and through advocating for viewpoint diversity, constructive disagreement, and really making this something that is now in the discourse, but then on a personal level as well. He was describing some of the backlash on Twitter that was going right now about the book, both for and against, accusing of being both right and left. And something I'll leave with John McWhorter that I think applies to Musa is that there's a certain point at which those of us in academia or journalism, there's a sense that there's fear that if we express something that is counter to the conformist viewpoint against whatever the biblical consensus is, that we're going to be personally attacked, and we'll lose some of our symbolic capital. We'll lose peer support. We may lose, the sabbatical committee won't vote for our sabbatical, or we'll get some other type of thing. But what John McWhorter says is at one point, individually, we have to stand up and demonstrate courage. And that certainly is what Musa is doing and has done in this book. And so I applaud him, and I'm honored to be here tonight. Thank you so much for having me. So we're going to begin questions and answers. Who is passing around? Is there a mic that's going to keep?
Oh, yeah, there's some.
Oh, so if you could please line up, maybe that will be easier to get.
I can pass it around too.
The line, I'm sorry. Too conformist.
I'm going to take the mic.
Have a mic.
I'm going to get my steps in. All right, let's get you first. And let you run it to the best.
All right.
So let's have some break.
Thank you for the engaging discussion. I mean, my thoughts on this is that a structural critique is hard for anybody to adopt because it involves power interests. So if you look at historical political economy, people don't give up privileges easily. So all the research I've written, I don't remember, I guess it was this Princeton professor who said, I've studied societies from Roman Empire to now. And if you look at the Gini coefficient about equal resources, there's only 4 things that bring it down, and it's like war, revolution, high stuff. So in no case did he find a democratic body in a normal political time voting to take away privileges. So something else is going on. So if you look at the problems in American society that we've had like since the 60s, this whole privatization of education, the mass incarceration. I mean, simple things like that. You could take those metrics, which we're using in other areas right now, and put them up there and say, could you get back to 1967? Nobody's doing that when there was 200,000 people in prison instead of 2 million, right? No, can't figure that out. Can't figure out the ratio of student debt in 1967 to now. We can't get back to that because that's not a part of anybody's metric or plan. This is even under conventional liberalism. That's how far we've gone astray, okay? So my thing is, why we retreated into this symbolic capitalism, because that opposition from the late 60s that failed had to be absorbed. And at that time, the universities were fairly open, cheap, inexpensive, and that was an area where we could control that. Nobody really took much of an interest in that. Of course, now things have changed because now we're a source of opposition, albeit limited, right? So I don't know how you get around that bind that we're in, but I think you have to introduce a structural critique with goals and objectives that the community really needs to be. It's got to be a reduction of income, and all that stuff can be measured. And you have research on that, you know, from Piketty at Harvard and all the stuff there that they've done. Raj Chetty has done about equality. That stuff has to be front and center because the cultural stuff is just not going to move the needle on any of that. That's my opinion.
I should add, so I agree with you completely. So the book actually spends a lot of time doing exactly this and actually drawing from a lot of the work by Chetty and Piketty and all of those folks, as well as some of my own work. So yeah, I mean, and in fact, one of the big innovations of the book is to, a lot of times when people talk about things like wokeness or the Great Awakening or whatever, it's this kind of weird thing that exists in the heavens, or they tell these weird intellectual, not weird, but like, and there's some value to them, but they tell these like intellectual genealogies of how these ideas came over from France or something like this. That's not what this book does. That's not what this book does. This book is actually tightly focused on how these changes to the global socioeconomic order, how these changes to institutions, how the changing role of these knowledge economy professionals in institutional terms, in the political sphere and so on, how these relate to these changing ways that we justify inequalities. And so it's telling a story of the political economy, of the knowledge economy. I mean, that's how I think of the book personally. It's a story of the political economy, of the knowledge economy. It has a 100-year historical arc. It's kind of very focused on institutions and systems and things like that. So all to say, I agree with you completely. I agree.
And I think that the iron cage that we're left with at the end of the book, to kind of draw on what you were saying and what Musa was pointing out about the social economy, is that there's an incentive structure that's now set up for symbolic capitalists that rewards you for using your totemic capital, for playing into some type of victimization, real or imagined. And so, how do we disrupt that within the larger structures of the economy, even at the levels of college admissions? Essays that are being written that point out all the ways in which we're victimized. This now is so widespread that it's part of the larger structure that we have to contend with.
And actually, one of the perverse effects, I'm sorry, I'll let someone ask a question in a second, but I just want to mention that one of the perverse effects actually of this focus on having people perform victimhood and stuff to gain entry into elite spaces is that the people who are most disadvantaged by this are people who are already disadvantaged. So it turns out, it turns out that people who are from relatively affluent backgrounds and who went to good elite private schools and whatever are the people who know how to tell the right stories that tug on the heartstrings of elite gatekeepers and stuff. Whereas a lot of people from less advantaged backgrounds, they don't know how to tell those stories in the same way, and often they find them distasteful. Like and even when they tell these stories, they tell them the wrong way. Like they'll tell stories. Like what you're supposed to do is tell a heroic bootstrapping story of how you face these disadvantages in life, but you as a result of grit and determination, you kind of pulled yourself up by your bootstraps, and now you're committed to paying it forward. And so there's this whole kind of narrative about how you came from the bottom and rose to the top, but you still keep it real and all of this. Okay, so people who come from less advantaged backgrounds, even when they talk about some of the challenges they face, they tend to like discuss how it was a result of things like lucky breaks, or the people, or people like their parents or other people who helped it, supported them, and things like this. They don't tell the kind of heroic bootstrapping story you're supposed to tell. And as a result, when we kind of make all of these gatekeeping policies that are designed around telling stories of disadvantage, we actually stack the deck in favor of the privileged. And this is actually a socioeconomic analysis of how culture works, right?
Yeah. Hi, Musa, that was very interesting. There's a lot that I agree with you on. For example, COVID and the poor treatment of young people under COVID. I also agree with you about NIMBYism, and yes, rich elites have always gamed the system to work for themselves, and that sucks. But I do worry that by concentrating on the intellectuals v. the masses, so to speak, and that you're actually losing sight of things that are genuinely wrong with society. For example, things are going backwards for women in this country. My daughter does not have the same rights over what happens to her own body as her grandmother did because of, what's happened with Roe v. Wade, for example. We do have the first, can I just say the first realistic female candidate for president. We still haven't had a woman president in this country. I mean, at least in Britain, I'm half American, but at least in Britain we had a few queens, Queen Victoria, Queen Elizabeth, and then we've had 3 women leaders. This country hasn't had a woman leader, and the woman who is standing for leader, whatever the merits of her politics, has been accused by the other side of getting to the top on her knees. There are real wrongs that affect people in this country that I think by over-concentrating on a kind of woke mind virus loses sight of where people's real rights are at, particularly women's, I'd say right now.
Well, absolutely. So what the book does actually is it highlights how, if we look at like who benefits from gendered inequalities and how do they benefit in concrete terms. That's what I try to do in the book, rather than doing the kind of culture worry stuff. We can see that a lot of the problems are created by people like us. I mean, one of the things that I well, on abortion specifically, it's that's a Republican Democrat issue. But when you talk about other forms of gendered exploitation, they're actually much more pronounced in some of the institutions, and gendered exclusion for that matter. For instance, the knowledge industries, the pay gaps between men and women are actually much bigger in the knowledge industries than they are in other places. This despite the fact that the knowledge industries are overwhelmingly liberal, democratic places. Almost everyone here identifies as a feminist, or at least is afraid to disidentify with feminism, and yet the kind of gendered wage gaps are much larger here, and they're kind of larger the bigger you go. And so there are a number of these kinds of issues that we, where we kind of over-focus, like the 2 stories that we like to tell ourselves about what's wrong with everything. There's basically 2 villains. There's those darn Republicans, and then there's the millionaires and the billionaires. But the thing is, both of those stories are do a really poor job of explaining a lot of the things that we don't like about the world. So just really briefly, if you look at if aliens came down to Earth and just beamed up everyone who ever voted for Trump, a lot of the problems that we're concerned about actually wouldn't change much. So if you look at places like New York and California, for instance, Democrats control them and have for a long time. In places like New York City, it's basically one-party rule. The primary election is the election. And in places like New York and California, 1 out of every 12 residents is a millionaire. A millionaire, 1 out of 12. But they also have the highest poverty rates in the country. They have some of the most like New York City has the most racially segregated school systems in the country. And we can't blame Republicans for any of this. Republicans are not present in a meaningful way. And so like we could delete the Republicans, But a lot of these places where wealth and power are concentrated and so on, it's not, the Republicans are clearly not the problem. And the same is true for the millionaires and billionaires. I mean, almost everything we don't like about the millionaires and the billionaires and the multinational corporations, if you look at how those things actually happen in concrete terms, how the terrible things actually happen in concrete terms, it's actually symbolic capitalists who are doing and implementing most of the things that we find distasteful.
So first things first, I want to congratulate you on publishing your book. I can't wait to read it. So she kind of asked a question that was pretty similar to mine. I know you focus specifically about the
business. I love her.
I know you focus specifically about the failure of mainly progressive elites or those who identify as such for, actually putting their money where their mouth is. I think this is unbelievably important because I've always had a more, Audre Lorde perspective where social justice issues are argued about primarily by white liberals who make arguments by talking over those affected, and primarily white conservatives who simply don't want to budge on them. So I think one of the things that I think this just generally follows and tracks with a lot of marginalized communities just everywhere. And one of the first thing that popped into my head when I saw the title was, the term woke is pretty loaded, especially in today's age. And I personally think a lot of the issues about wokeness, and we'll see once I read the book if this changes, do fall on the right, at least in terms of recency, primarily because they just don't shut up about it. Sure, the liberals may be useless, but they aren't vehemently attacking any initiatives on the level that conservatives are. And I think, a good example of this is when Goldman Sachs implemented a policy that starting in 2021, it would only take companies public if they had leadership that consisted of women and people of color. This was a great initiative and was a social justice initiative that essentially made it easier for qualified people of color to gain opportunities. They simply wouldn't have access to because of their race. But conservative commentators criticize this move as woke. This is identity politics over meritocracy. They argued that forcing companies to meet diversity quotas would potentially lead to less qualified individuals, again, without providing any reasons as to why they would be unqualified, or being selected for leadership roles based on their gender or race. So I think, obviously this is a clearly nuanced issue that deserves criticisms on both sides, definitely. But I am curious about what you think about the right, which has made vocal and legislative attempts to undermine social justice initiatives, which, was kind of where we were trying to go with wokeness in the first place.
Sure. I mean, I think that there are a few really interesting dimensions to that question and observation. One thing that I think is just really important to bear in mind is that it's not obvious to me how diversifying the kind of boards of Goldman Sachs or something would necessarily address a lot of the deeper problems. I don't think that there's anything wrong with that, obviously, but one of the things that I highlight in the book is that when you look at the changes that come about after these periods of awakening, the main thing that changes is that there are these openings that are created for elites who identify with historically marginalized and disadvantaged groups. So if you're someone who's already well advantaged, it helps you reproduce your own position or help your children reproduce your position. But people who are not already advantaged or don't benefit much at all. So diversifying Goldman, for instance, if you're not someone with a college degree or you're not someone who graduated from Columbia or Harvard, you're never going to be on the board of Goldman. And so that's a change that doesn't matter for your life at all. And so similar kind of initiatives like that are, they're not bad, but they also don't really we shouldn't overstate the significance of that kind of reform. But you're absolutely right about two things. One is that there's definitely this contestation around woke. And it's happened before with terms like politically correct, where there's this kind of dispute within the left about wokeness or political correctness, and then the right seizes on it, and they use it as a cudgel to attack everything they don't like, and then eventually people stop associating with the word at all. So there was a great poll that came out recently that asked Americans, what do you think about woke or wokeness? And most Americans had pretty positive associations with the term. And then they asked, if someone called you woke, would you view that as an insult or a compliment? And overwhelmingly, they were like an insult. They would understand it to be an insult. Even though they viewed the term positively, if someone called them woke, the only reason why someone would call you woke today is if they're insulting you in some way, right? Okay, last thing I'll say on this question of backlash, because I think this is really important. One of the things that I highlight in the book is that people who work in the symbolic professions, we tend to be kind of politically unusual. Like, we think about politics in ways that are very different than most other Americans. We engage in political activism and stuff in ways that are just weird to a lot of people who are not highly educated, relatively affluent kind of people. So we seem like kind of Martians to normies. And these gaps, which are big under ordinary times, they get even bigger during these periods of awakening, because people in fields like journalism and law and so on, we tend to shift a lot. But most other Americans just kind of stay on the same steady keel. So the gap between us grows, even though we're going in kind of the same direction. Since we're going at different rates, the gap gets bigger. Okay. The gap doesn't just get bigger, though. It also becomes more salient. So people care about the gap more than they used to during these periods of awakening, precisely because people who work in these professions often become more militant about mocking and demeaning and trying to censor anyone who disagrees with us, villainizing them as racists and bigots if they don't agree with our preferred kind of policies, which we ourselves only adopted 5 minutes ago in some cases. And so people care about this gap more than they used to, and that creates an opportunity for political entrepreneurs, typically associated with the right, to kind of gain power and status and votes and stuff by trying to bring our institutions under control. So they say things like, and this will probably sound familiar, journalistic outlets are just a propaganda arm for the Democratic Party. We need to bring them under control to get them back on the business of telling the truth. Or universities are just indoctrinating children. They're not. We need to bring them under. We need to bring these academics to heel, so that they.
You what an H3 can't tell you to what class.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and so one effect of the awakenings is they tend to kind of devolve into culture wars, and kind of result in backlash and lower trust in the institutions that we're a part of. This isn't just something unique to this kind of post-2010 period. This is something that repeats in each of these episodes. And it also creates space, not just for political entrepreneurs on the right to kind of campaign and win elections by running against us, but it also often creates a market for new institutions, alternative knowledge production institutions. So like after the 1960s, there was this assumption that universities are lost. You can't really fix them. So what did they do? They launched a bunch of right-leaning think tanks, starting with Heritage and then Cato. After the 1990s awakening, there was this assumption that the media is lost. So what did they do? They launched Fox News, which eats everyone's lunch in terms of cable news. They completely dominate. And then in the more recent period, you see these attempts by people like Donald Trump to acquire Truth Social, or Elon Musk to take over Twitter, or Peter Thiel to buy Rumble. And the thing about it is, when these alternative infrastructures get created, it often has really pernicious effects on us, on mainstream symbolic capitalists, in an enduring way. One, because again, sometimes they eat our lunch in the case of Fox News, like they actually beat the mainstream institutions. But two, the way that they get eyeballs and the way that they get viewers, the way they keep themselves in business, is to basically all day, every day say the mainstream institutions are lying to you, they're mistrustful, they're biased, and so on. That's how they stay in business. That's like literally their business model, is fomenting the culture wars indefinitely and fomenting trust in mainstream institutions indefinitely. And so to the extent that we actually do seem to look like the caricatures that they try to paint of us during these periods of awakening, we're basically handing shovels to our own grave diggers. It's a big problem. And these awakenings, yeah, they usually do result in one of the unfortunate consequences of these awakenings usually is it empowers both these alternative institutions and kind of political entrepreneurs who campaign against us.
The time for one more question.
So I'll end as I think academics could grow so years and obviously now a lot is reduced pieces that basically involve the same. What I wanted to ask is about our city, how it goes very. So I just and I paused because you see with like Bank of America sponsoring deep crime, it's like, you know, because you look at it and it's like it follows by like, they made the fact that it can constitute you as understand. So like, this is right, so you're like, it's our spec over TV, whatever. And I wanted to ask what you to do, and then that created this organization of but certainly social values instead of economy to co-opting of social range of that skiing as previously it's like some whether sports spot whether you get best of the tax and other the such tax basically in all that is said like sponsoring those sort of is better as far as price to people but where that's how they did how right oh that's backline and against pine guy political so I wonder what's it this to be like I was like super odd issues out because the
well, I think that my book talks about this, about the history of corporate social responsibility and how that became embroiled in criminal justice reform, particularly because you had the Business Roundtable essentially take a position in support of criminal justice legislation in 2018 and getting behind all kinds of second chance initiatives. Like New Hour currently is getting some support from Capital One for the women who are returning home from prison. And hey, we will take it. Thank you very much, right? We need the resources. But to your question, and then I'll pass it to Musa, corporate social responsibility goes back to the 1960s, even into civil rights movement. But in the 1980s, what you really saw was that for the first time, corporations became much more comfortable with the idea that getting involved because of the anti-apartheid movement, getting involved and taking a stance on that would not only not be risky for them, but actually would gain them traction. And so that was the beginning of corporations beginning to use that as a form of capital in getting people to support them. And during Black Lives Matter, during George Floyd, what we saw was if corporations were not lacking out their Twitter and taking Coach, I remember Coach made a statement about George Floyd's, Gushers made a statement.
I've been waiting for Gushers' opinion.
Gushers' opinion matters, right? Tide matters. But if they weren't taking a stance on that, they were being attacked for, you know, not caring enough about the people. And so I think that we can trace this back at least to the civil rights movement, particularly the 1980s. But it's both that corporations are seeing a profit motive, but also because there is demand within a certain sector of the liberal population to see that type of manifestation of commitment to causes.
Yeah, this is one of the things that I mean, I think part of the story is that a lot of institutions, and especially corporations, increasingly rely, as the institutions themselves are operating globally and they're becoming more complex and all of this, they actually rely more on symbolic capitalists than they used to. The share of these companies that is symbolic capitalists is larger, like the administration has grown in a lot of these corporations. And so as competition to like, to retain and be in the good graces of like the best talent or whatever has also intensified. And so like part of what you see for some of these movements is they're not even always worried about customers, they're also worried about their employees and showing their employees that they share the values of the workers who are, a lot of employees want their companies to show that they, and actually not just employees in general, actually symbolic capitalists are weird in this way. Most other workers, actually they don't care about their company's political opinions, they don't want their companies to take political opinions, but symbolic capitalists really do. We want to know that
there are rebellions like within Netflix.
Yes, insurgencies to make the companies take a stand. And that's something that's just that's an example of the weird way, one of the weird ways that we engage in politics, as if Gushers taking a stand on Black Lives Matter is going to save anyone's life.
Did actually.
So I think that's part of the story. Real quick, another part of the story is that the symbolic professions themselves, like the share of Americans who work in these fields, has grown a lot over time. And so before it was the case that if you alienated normies, you'd be out of business. If you were a politician and you alienated kind of normie Americans, you would lose the election. If you were a company that alienated normie Americans, you'd go out of business. But that's not the case today. In the world where like 1 in 3 Americans has a bachelor's degree, and they're increasingly consolidated into a small number of these really tight markets that are interconnected with millionaires and billionaires and these big financial and media systems and all of this kind of stuff. You can have a company that makes money hand over fist while alienating huge swaths of America. You can have a political party and politicians that win elections and become very competitive despite alienating huge swaths of America. And so a lot of times, companies know that the things that they're doing are going to alienate huge swaths of the public, and they don't care. They're willing to write those people off because it's actually the kind of margins are in their favor to appeal to symbolic capitalists. Tima's giving me a frowny face.
They're going to... And maybe that's a fitting conclusion that what we're talking about may alienate us from a certain part of the population, but hey, there's an audience. So, thank you all so much.